Welcome to History Teller YT, where untold stories come alive. In this series, we embark on a journey through the struggles, resilience, and survival of the Subanen people of Mindanao. Too often, Indigenous histories are erased from mainstream narratives, replaced by stories of empires, wars, and politicians. But history is not only about those in power. It is also about communities on the margins, people who resist in silence and endure in defiance. The Subanen are one such people. For centuries, they have lived in the mountains and valleys of the Zamboanga Peninsula, guarding sacred forests, rivers, and mountains that they believe are alive with ancestral spirits. They are farmers, hunters, weavers, and storytellers, bound together by rituals and laws older than the nation itself. Yet their story is also one of constant struggle against colonization, displacement, mining, corruption, and violence. In telling their history, we uncover not only the pain of exploitation, but also the extraordinary resilience that has kept them alive through centuries of adversity. This series is more than an academic narrative. It is an invitation to see history differently, to understand that the survival of indigenous peoples like the Subanen is also the survival of humanity's conscience and of the earth itself. Over the next 20 parts, you will hear a story that moves across landscapes of struggle and resilience. We will begin with the meaning of land in Subanen identity, explore how mining desecrated sacred sites, and reveal how corruption and collusion undermined indigenous rights. We will listen to the voices of elders silenced by intimidation, see families displaced by armed groups, and confront the painful murders of leaders who dared to resist. Yet this is not only a story of loss. We will also witness the persistence of rituals, the power of traditional governance, the role of women as cultural anchors, and the rising activism of Subanen youth. We will see how churches, NGOs, and global networks join their cause, transforming local resistance into international advocacy. And finally, we will end with lessons for all of us about resilience, justice, and the future of indigenous struggles. Each part will take you deeper, with 3 segments per chapter, building a tapestry of voices that demand to be heard. This is not a simple narrative with heroes and villains. It is a living history where survival itself is victory, and where the moral lies not in triumph, but in endurance. So I invite you, wherever you are, whether in a classroom, at home, or on your journey, to stay with us through this 2-hour exploration. Listen not just with your ears, but with your heart. Ask yourself, what does it mean for a people to fight for survival in their own homeland? What lessons do the Subanen carry for a world facing ecological collapse, political corruption, and cultural erasure? On History Teller YT, we believe that remembering such stories is an act of justice. By giving voice to the Subanen, we remind ourselves that history is not only about the past, but also about the choices we make in the present. As you listen, think about your own role in shaping a future where indigenous peoples are no longer silenced, where their wisdom is respected, and where their lands are protected. Stay until the end, for every chapter builds to a deeper understanding of resilience and hope. This is not just their story. It is ours too, for in their survival lies a mirror to our humanity. Welcome to the story of the Subanen. Welcome to a journey of truth, struggle, and endurance. Welcome to History Teller YT. For the Subanen people, the land is not just soil underfoot. It is the heart of their identity, the thread that ties generations together. Long before colonial powers arrived, the Subanen thrived in the Zamboanga Peninsula, where mountains, rivers, and forests were not only sources of food, but also sacred spaces. Their oral traditions speak of the spirits who dwell in the forests, the guardians of rivers, and the ancestors who walk unseen across the hills. This connection is more than symbolic. The land determines social order, agricultural cycles, and spiritual practice. Losing the land means losing the essence of being Subanen. That is why the encroachment of outside forces, especially the modern machinery of mining, feels to them like a direct attack on their survival. The story of Canatuan Mountain shows how fragile this balance has become. Once a revered sacred site, the mountain was transformed into an open pit mine, tearing away not only the physical environment, but the very spiritual center of the community. The first challenge, therefore, is not just about minerals or profits. It is about the dignity and continuity of a people who have always called these mountains home. Without their domain, they are strangers even within their ancestral villages, displaced spiritually and materially at once. The Subanen's current struggles cannot be understood in isolation. They are the echoes of centuries of marginalization. When the Spaniards colonized the Philippines, they forced many indigenous groups into the uplands, labeling them pagans and outsiders. Later, American colonization deepened the push to exploit Mindanao's natural resources, introducing logging concessions and the promise of mineral wealth. The Philippine Republic, in turn, inherited these structures of exploitation. By the late 20th century, multinational companies were given permits to enter Subanen territory, often with little consultation. Thus, the Subanen entered the 21st century already scarred by dispossession. They held on to the hope that new laws, especially the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, IPRA, of 1997, would finally protect them. But when the Canatuan mine was approved in 2004 without their genuine consent, many realized that legal protections could be undermined by politics and money. This was not just a local dispute over gold. It was a historical continuation of colonization, only now carried out in the language of development and economic growth. To the Subanen, the mountain's destruction carried the full weight of centuries of betrayal, reinforcing their sense of being second-class citizens in their own homeland. To outsiders, Canatuan Mountain might have seemed like an untapped resource, rich with gold, silver, and copper. To the Subanen, however, it was a sacred mountain, a place woven into their rituals and collective memory. Elders would recall how offerings were made at its peak, how stories of ancestors were told under its shadow. When a mining company arrived, bringing bulldozers and explosives, the community experienced not only ecological devastation, but a spiritual wound. Imagine a cathedral being desecrated, its altars torn apart and replaced with machinery. That was how the Subanen felt as the forest was stripped bare and rivers turned muddy with silt. Their sacred space became an industrial zone, guarded by fences and armed men. The trauma was not only environmental, but psychological. Children grew up watching the sacred mountain bleed, while elders lamented that the spirits had been angered. This spiritual desecration left the Subanen with a wound that laws and money cannot heal. It is here that their story intersects with global struggles of indigenous peoples, who across continents have watched their holy places consumed in the name of progress. For the Subanen, the Canatuan mine was not just a mine. It was the visible scar of a deeper dispossession, one that continues to haunt them today. When the Canatuan Mine project was announced in the early 2000s, it was promoted under the language of progress. Government officials and company representatives framed it as a catalyst for economic growth, promising jobs, schools, and health services for the surrounding communities. In theory, the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, IPRA, of 1997 guaranteed that the Subanen would be consulted through the principle of free, prior, and informed consent, FPIC. This meant that before any development project could move forward, the The people must first be given the opportunity to learn the details, discuss them freely, and decide without coercion. On paper, this principle was revolutionary, a legal shield against the centuries of exploitation that indigenous groups had endured. But what unfolded in Canatuan revealed how fragile the promise of law could be when confronted with powerful interests. Reports soon emerged that the FPIC process was bypassed. Meetings were either rushed, manipulated, or conducted without the presence of the majority of Subanen community members. Some leaders were allegedly excluded, while others were pressured or co-opted. The result was a consent process that looked legitimate on paper but lacked authenticity in practice. For many Subanen families, this realization was devastating. What was supposed to be a safeguard of their sovereignty became another tool for stripping it away. The gap between the promises of development and the lived reality of dispossession became painfully clear, marking a betrayal not only of the people, but of the spirit of the law itself. Once the mining operations began in earnest, the Subanen immediately felt the consequences. The mountain was gouged open, leaving behind deep scars that could be seen from afar. Rivers that once provided fish and clean water turned murky, choked with silt and chemical runoff. The forest, home to medicinal plants, fruit-bearing trees, and wildlife, was steadily destroyed. For generations, the Subanen had relied on swidden agriculture, shifting cultivation that respected the natural rhythm of the land. They grew corn, root crops, and rice on carefully chosen plots, allowing old fields to rest and regenerate. Hunting, fishing, and gathering supplemented this sustainable lifestyle. But mining disrupted all of this. With soil erosion and water pollution, farming yields dropped. Fish disappeared from the streams. Even the air was no longer the same, carrying dust and fumes from the mining site. Livelihoods that had endured for centuries were overturned in less than a decade. Worse still, the benefits promised by the mining company were unevenly distributed. A few jobs went to locals, but many were temporary or low-paying. The wealth from gold, copper, and silver flowed outwards to corporate headquarters and government coffers, while the Subanen were left to deal with poisoned rivers and infertile fields. This was more than an economic blow. It was the unraveling of a way of life built on harmony with the environment. What had been an ancestral land became an industrial wasteland, and the Subanen were forced to bear the cost of a prosperity they would never enjoy. Faced with the mounting destruction, the Subanen turned to their traditional system of justice, the Gukum. This council of elders, rooted in custom law, has long been the moral compass of the community. After hearing testimonies, weighing the harm done, and invoking the spiritual responsibility to the ancestors, the Gukum ruled decisively against the mining operations. They ordered the company, TVI Resource Development, to vacate the land and pay restitution for the damage inflicted. This was not just a legal ruling, it was a spiritual pronouncement, binding under Subanen law and tradition. For the people, the Gukum's decision reaffirmed their collective dignity and reminded them that, even in crisis, they retained moral authority over their land. But in the Philippine legal system, the ruling had no enforceable weight. Courts did not recognize it. Government agencies ignored it. The mine continued to operate despite the tribal mandate. This exposed the painful gap between indigenous systems of justice and the state's framework of law. To the Subanen, it was yet another layer of marginalization. Their voices might carry authority within their community, but in the halls of power, they were silenced. The Gukum's verdict thus became both a symbol of resistance and a reminder of the structural barriers they faced. It showed the resilience of Subanen governance, but also the limits imposed by a political system that valued corporate interests over indigenous rights. In the end, the mine stood as a testament not only to environmental loss, but to the erosion of justice itself. One of the most painful realities the Subanen have faced is that the very institutions meant to protect them often stand on the side of their exploiters. In theory, the Philippine government has a constitutional duty to respect indigenous rights and to enforce the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, IPRA. Yet in practice, mining firms frequently secure the backing of influential politicians, regulatory agencies, and even local governments. In the case of the Canatuan mine, there were widespread reports of collusion between company representatives and government officials. Mining permits were fast-tracked, environmental compliance certificates were issued with little transparency, and local consultations were either ignored or conducted only for show. For the Subanen, this created the bitter impression that the state was not a neutral referee, but a silent partner in exploitation. When Indigenous leaders questioned the legality of the project, they were often met not with dialogue, but with bureaucratic stonewalling. Meanwhile, government officials proudly showcased the mine as a symbol of development, claiming it would bring jobs and revenues to the province. But beneath this official narrative lay a different truth, that corporate interests and political patronage often overrode justice. For many Subanen, the sense of betrayal cut deep, for the institutions that had promised equality under the law now appeared complicit in their marginalization. It was not only the land that was stolen, it was the trust that a democratic system would ever stand on their side. Perhaps even more damaging than external collusion was the way mining interests penetrated the Subanen communities themselves. Allegations surfaced that certain elders and local leaders were bribed to sign documents granting consent for the project. Some were reportedly offered money, while others received promises of jobs or development projects. These actions created deep fissures in the Subanen social fabric. Traditionally, decisions were made collectively, with elders serving as guides and moral anchors. But when mining firms and their allies selectively courted individuals, they sowed division where unity once stood. Families began to argue. Leaders were accused of betrayal, and suspicion spread among neighbors. This internal weakening was perhaps one of the most effective tools of control. By dividing the community, companies made it harder for the Subanen to mount a united resistance. The bitterness of these divisions still lingers today. Younger generations look at some elders with skepticism, wondering whether they acted for the good of the people or for their own survival. What was once a cohesive society bound by trust and ritual has had to wrestle with the scars of internal betrayal. This phenomenon was not unique to the Subanen. Across the Philippines, other indigenous communities experienced similar patterns, where corporations manipulated traditional decision-making to create the illusion of consent. But for the Subanen, the loss of solidarity was a wound as serious as the loss of land. It eroded their ability to collectively defend themselves, leaving them vulnerable to further encroachment and deepening the sense of isolation. The principle of FPIC was designed to be a shield for indigenous communities, ensuring that no project could move forward without their genuine agreement. Yet in practice, FPIC has too often been reduced to a box-ticking exercise. In the Subanen case, many leaders pointed out that meetings were held without proper translation into their language. Documents were signed under pressure, and information about the long-term impacts of mining was withheld. In some instances, so-called consultations were conducted not with the whole community, but with hand-picked individuals who were more likely to agree. This undermined the very spirit of FPIC. Consent, by definition, must be informed, voluntary, and collective. What the Subanen experienced instead was coercion disguised as dialogue. International observers, including human rights organizations, criticize these practices as clear violations of both Philippine law and international conventions on indigenous rights. Yet, despite the documentation, enforcement remained weak. For the Subanen, the erosion of FPIC was not just a technical failure. It was an existential crisis. If the one legal safeguard meant to empower them could be so easily manipulated, what protection did they truly have? Their experience revealed a grim reality: that rights on paper are not enough when power, money, and corruption dictate the outcome. This realization hardened their resolve to resist, but also deepened their sense of alienation from a system that claimed to serve them. The struggle for genuine FPIC thus became symbolic of a larger fight for dignity, justice, and recognition in a society that often treated them as expendable. Leadership among the Subanen has always carried a deep responsibility. A tribal elder or indigenous people's mandatory representative, IPMR, does not simply lead in politics, but embodies the voice of the ancestors, the spirit of the community, and the bridge between the living and the unseen. Yet in recent decades, carrying such responsibility has become dangerous. Those who speak out against mining firms, corrupt local officials, or exploitative projects often find themselves the targets of harassment. Take the case of Bobby, a Subanen IPMR who openly resisted mining encroachment. Instead of his advocacy being heard as a legitimate defense of his people's rights, he faced retaliatory legal charges. Cases were filed against him, draining his energy and resources. His home was attacked by arson, reducing years of family labor to ashes. Assassination attempts were reported, chilling reminders of how far vested interests were willing to go to silence dissent. This kind of harassment was not an isolated incident. Across the peninsula, indigenous leaders who dared to stand firm became vulnerable to what activists describe as lawfare, the weaponization of legal cases against those who resist. Coupled with threats and physical attacks, this environment has turned leadership into an act of constant courage. The Subanen, who once looked to their elders for guidance in times of peace and war, now see them forced to navigate a battlefield where justice is distorted. For the leaders themselves, the price of integrity has often been isolation, fear, and the haunting knowledge that defending their people could cost them their lives. The intimidation of the Subanen has not stopped at harassment. It has escalated to outright violence. The murder of tribal elder Barlai Balives and his son remains one of the darkest chapters in recent memory. The brutality of the act, the mutilation of their bodies, was widely understood as more than personal vengeance. It was a calculated message meant to terrorize the wider community into submission. When news of their deaths spread, fear gripped entire villages. Families whispered about whether they might be next, and young people wondered if it was worth standing up for their rights. The murder carried a dual function. It physically eliminated respected leaders who could inspire resistance, and it psychologically weakened those left behind. Such acts of violence against tribal leaders are not random crimes. They're deeply political, often tied to the pressure of extracting consent for mining projects or silencing opposition to local corruption. Reports from human rights groups and church organizations have consistently documented these patterns. For the Subanen, however, these killings are not just statistics or case files. They're the loss of fathers, mentors, and storytellers, pillars of the community who carry the memory of generations. Every murder leaves behind not only grieving families, but also gaps in the transmission of knowledge and tradition. Violence against elders thus does more than extinguish lives. It destabilizes the cultural continuity of the Subanen, threatening to erase centuries of wisdom in the span of a single night of terror. The systematic harassment, legal intimidation, and outright violence against Subanen leaders are all part of a broader pattern. The use of fear as a tool of control. By targeting individuals, outside forces send a message to the whole community. If a respected elder can be murdered, if a prominent leader can be dragged through courts on fabricated charges, then what chance does an ordinary farmer or fisher folk have? Fear works silently, eroding the will to resist even without constant physical attacks. People begin to self-censor, avoiding public statements, refusing to attend rallies, or even hesitating to pray openly on sacred mountains now guarded by mining fences. This culture of fear weakens solidarity. Where once the Subanen gathered collectively to defend their ancestral lands, fear divides them into silent bystanders, each hoping not to be the next target. International human rights groups have long warned that such intimidation undermines democracy itself. For when indigenous peoples cannot freely exercise their rights, the entire social fabric of justice is compromised. Yet for the Subanen, the impact is felt most intimately in the hushed conversations at night, in the empty seats where elders once sat, and in the cautious glances of children who grow up learning that speaking truth may invite danger. Fear has become not only an emotional burden, but a political weapon, wielded with precision to suppress indigenous resistance. But even in the face of such darkness, sparks of courage remain. Each act of intimidation, though painful, has also planted seeds of defiance in the younger generation, seeds that may yet grow into a renewed struggle for justice. The New People's Army, NPA, the armed wing of the Communist Party of the Philippines, has long sought to establish influence in rural and indigenous territories. For the Subanen, their presence in ancestral domains has been a double-edged sword. On the one hand, NPA cadres often arrive with promises of defending indigenous communities against corporate exploitation and state-backed military operations. On the other hand, their methods involve coercion, threats, and forced recruitment, which destabilize the traditional governance of the Subanen. Tribal leaders have recounted instances where young men were pressured into joining the ranks, not out of ideological conviction, but fear of reprisal. Villages caught between the NPA and government forces often face harassment from both sides, suspected of siding with one whenever they engage with the other. This precarious position undermines the Subanen's autonomy. Rather than freely practicing their culture and managing their lands, they are forced into the role of pawns in a larger ideological conflict. For elders who have spent decades safeguarding peace, the intrusion of the NPA feels like a disruption of both social and spiritual harmony. What makes it even more tragic is that the Subanen's ancestral domains, already under siege from mining and corporate interests, now also serve as battlegrounds for armed struggle. Thus, the community faces a layered conflict: economic exploitation from companies, political neglect from the state, and militarized intimidation from insurgents. The Subanen's governance system, rooted in councils of elders and the authority of the Timue, relies on consensus, ritual, and respect for ancestral laws. This delicate system has historically allowed the community to resolve disputes without violence, maintaining cohesion even during times of scarcity. But the intrusion of armed groups has fractured this process. The NPA, for instance, often disregards the authority of tribal leaders, imposing their own people's courts or revolutionary taxation systems. Villagers have been forced to pay levies in the form of crops, livestock, or even money, diverting resources away from families already struggling with poverty. Leaders who resist are branded as collaborators with the military and threatened with punishment. In turn, state forces sometimes accuse Subanen leaders of harboring rebels, subjecting them to surveillance, raids, or even arrests. The result is a governance crisis. Traditional authority is weakened, while fear and suspicion dominate village life. Ritual gatherings that once celebrated agricultural cycles or honored spirits are overshadowed by the looming question of security. Will the community be accused of siding with the wrong faction? This uncertainty corrodes trust, not only between Subanen and outsiders, but within the community itself. The social fabric, already strained by mining, corruption, and displacement, now faces the added weight of militarization. For many Subanen, the disruption of governance is not just a political inconvenience, but an existential threat, eroding the very foundation of their cultural identity. The intrusion of armed groups has also led to waves of displacement across Subanen territories. Families have been forced to flee when clashes erupt between the NPA and the military, abandoning their crops, livestock, and ancestral homes. In evacuation centers, often located in towns far from the mountains, the Subanen face overcrowded conditions, lack of sanitation, and the humiliation of being treated as refugees in their own land. For children, displacement interrupts schooling and severs their connection to ancestral rituals, while elders grieve the loss of sacred spaces where ceremonies can no longer be performed. The trauma of sudden flight adds to the already heavy burden of poverty and cultural dislocation. Beyond physical displacement, there is also a spiritual one. Being uprooted from the land means being cut off from the very soil that anchors Subanen identity. Worse still, when communities eventually return, they often find their lands further encroached upon by logging, mining, or new settlers who take advantage of their absence. This cyclical pattern of displacement weakens their claims to territory and creates opportunities for outsiders to consolidate control. For the Subanen, displacement is not only a humanitarian crisis, but also a political strategy used by competing forces to weaken their resolve. In this sense, the intrusion of armed groups represents more than a temporary disruption. It is a long-term threat to the survival of their culture, governance, and ancestral bonds. Each cycle of conflict deepens the wounds of marginalization, leaving the Subanen to wonder if there will ever be a safe space for their people to live in peace. For years, the Subanen have faithfully submitted petitions, declarations, and ancestral domain claims to the National Commission on Indigenous Peoples and CIP, expecting that the law would finally recognize their rights. After all, the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, IPRA, explicitly states that Indigenous communities have the right to secure certificates of ancestral domain title, CADT, ensuring legal recognition of their lands. But the reality has been painfully slow. Documents languish in offices for years without resolution. Meetings are postponed indefinitely, or decisions are passed from one bureaucrat to another, leaving communities in limbo. For Subanen leaders, every delay translates into lost ground, both literally and figuratively. While the paperwork sits gathering dust, mining and logging operations continue to expand, carving away at ancestral forests and rivers. Each year of government inaction means another year of cultural erosion, another planning cycle disrupted, another sacred site desecrated. The inertia is not accidental. Critics argue that it reflects the state's tendency to prioritize economic interests over indigenous survival. Bureaucracy becomes a silent weapon, one that does not spill blood but bleeds a community of its hope. For the Subanen, waiting for government action has become a ritual of frustration. They march to offices with their petitions, only to be told to return next month, next year, or perhaps never. This inertia not only delays justice, but actively contributes to their disempowerment. For every moment of state silence becomes an opportunity for exploitation to deepen. Even when the state does act, the structures it creates often serve more to weaken indigenous autonomy than to strengthen it. The NCIP, for example, is supposed to be the guardian of indigenous rights, yet its local branches have been criticized for siding with corporations or government officials rather than communities. Decisions on free, prior, and informed consent, FPIC, are sometimes manipulated to legitimize projects rather than genuinely protect indigenous voices. In practice, this creates a parallel system of authority that undermines traditional governance. Instead of the Gukum or the Timue holding final say, communities are forced to depend on agencies whose loyalties may lie elsewhere. This dynamic strips the Subanen of self-determination, leaving them as petitioners begging for recognition instead of sovereign custodians of their land. Furthermore, state programs that do reach the Subanen often come with strings attached: short-term relief goods during crises, or token livelihood projects that do not address the root issues of displacement and exploitation. These initiatives may create an image of state benevolence, but fail to confront the deeper injustices. To the Subanen, it often feels like the state recognizes them only when convenient, while ignoring their cries when their lands and lives are most under threat. This duality, where rights exist on paper but not in practice, has left many communities disillusioned. Trust in government institutions erodes, replaced by the grim recognition that survival may depend not on state support, but on their own resilience. Neglect and bureaucracy are not abstract concepts for the Subanen. They manifest in daily struggles. Families walk hours to fetch clean water because rivers have been polluted by mining. Children miss school because their families cannot afford supplies, and government programs for indigenous education are sporadic at best. Health services are rare, and when available, they are often underfunded or ill-equipped. Even in political representation, the Subanen find themselves sidelined. Indigenous peoples' mandatory representatives, IPMRs, are given token seats in local councils, but their voices are often drowned out or disregarded. In moments of crisis, such as forced displacement due to armed conflict or natural disasters, the Subanen are often the last to receive aid, if they receive any at all. This everyday marginalization compounds the trauma of environmental loss and cultural dislocation. It reinforces the sense that the state sees them not as citizens with equal rights, but as afterthoughts in a nation driven by profit and political expedience. Yet despite these burdens, the Subanen persist. They plant crops even in degraded soil, rebuild homes after fires and raids, and continue to hold rituals on whatever land remains sacred and untouched. Their endurance in the face of neglect is both a testament to their resilience and a damning indictment of a system that continually fails them. For the Subanen, neglect is not merely a policy failure. It is a lived experience, a daily reminder that their survival depends on enduring a state of abandonment while resisting forces determined to erase them. When the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, IPRA, also known as Republic Act No. 8371, was signed into law in 1997, many hailed it as a turning point for indigenous communities across the Philippines. For the first time, ancestral domain was formally recognized as a right, not merely a privilege granted by the state. The law promised certificates of ancestral domain title, CADT, protection of cultural integrity, self-governance, and priority access to government services. For the Subanen, who had endured centuries of displacement, from Spanish colonization to American exploitation to the Philippine Republic's neglect, IPRA seemed like long-awaited justice. Elders gathered in hope, seeing the law as a shield for their grandchildren's future. The principle of free, prior, and informed consent, FPIC, was codified, ensuring that no project could proceed without genuine consultation. On paper, this was revolutionary. It acknowledged that indigenous peoples were not simply citizens, but sovereign custodians of land and culture. Yet almost immediately, cracks appear between the promise of the law and the reality of its implementation. Bureaucratic delays, weak enforcement, and political interference diluted its potential. For the Subanen, IPRA became a symbol of hope shadowed by disappointment. It reminded them that rights can exist in text, but vanish in practice when power and money enter the equation. In the Philippine political system, laws are often shaped not just by their content, but by who enforces them. IPRA entrusted the National Commission on Indigenous Peoples, NCP, with its implementation, but this institution has frequently been accused of bowing to political and corporate interests. Mining corporations, logging firms, and agribusinesses often enjoy the backing of powerful politicians who see resource extraction as both a revenue source and a means of patronage. Local officials, seeking campaign funds or alliances, sometimes collude with these corporations, bypassing indigenous communities altogether. For the Subanen, this means that even when they invoke IPRA to protect their domains, their voices are drowned out by the influence of elites. Courts that should defend indigenous rights are often inaccessible due to cost and complexity, while local governments claim to act for development, but in reality serve vested interests. This imbalance reveals the weakness of legal protections when placed against entrenched systems of corruption. Political patronage becomes the filter through which laws are applied. Protective provisions are ignored, while exploitative loopholes are amplified. For the Subanen, the message is clear. Survival in such a system requires not only asserting their legal rights, but also confronting the deep networks of power that distort those rights. The gap between IPRA's promise and political realities is most painfully evident in the daily lives of the Subanen. In theory, cats should secure their ancestral domains. In practice, many applications remain unresolved decades after filing. In theory, FPIC should empower them to reject harmful projects. In practice, it is manipulated through bribery, coercion, or selective consultation. In theory, self-governance should give tribal councils authority. In practice, local officials often override their decisions. These contradictions leave the Subanen trapped in a cycle of frustration. They attend workshops about their rights, sign petitions, and submit documents, only to see mining trucks roll past their villages as if the law did not exist. The sense of betrayal runs deep, for it is not only the corporations that fail them, but also the state that proclaims protection while enabling exploitation. For families struggling to grow crops on eroded soil, or elders watching sacred mountains stripped bare, the law feels like an empty promise. Yet even amidst this disillusionment, the Subanen continue to invoke IPRA, reminding the state of its obligations. They carry copies of the law to public hearings, cite its provisions in protests, and teach their youth about its potential. In doing so, they transform a broken promise into a weapon of resistance. The law may not have fulfilled its promise, but in the hands of the Subanen, it becomes a banner under which they continue to fight for dignity, survival, and recognition. For the Subanen, the land is not just a physical space, it is sacred geography. Every mountain, river, and forest carries stories, rituals, and spiritual meaning. Among these, certain sites like Mount Canatuan are considered holy, serving as places where elders commune with spirits, where rituals are performed to honor ancestors, and where communities gather for renewal. When mining operations turned Mount Canatuan into an open-pit gold mine, the desecration was not only physical, but deeply spiritual. To the Subanen, it was akin to watching a cathedral demolished or a mosque bulldozed. Elders wept as bulldozers crushed the very ground where prayers had been offered for generations. Ritual spaces, once filled with chanting and offerings, became occupied by fences, guards, and machinery. This loss struck at the heart of Subanen identity. Sacred sites anchor their cosmology, their sense of who they are and where they belong. Without them, spiritual practices are disrupted, and the link between ancestors and descendants is weakened. This desecration cannot be measured only in environmental damage or lost income. It represents a profound cultural wound. For young Subanen, growing up without access to these sacred sites means inheriting a diminished version of their heritage. The stories they hear from elders no longer match what they see before their eyes. Where there should be a mountain of reverence, there is now a pit of extraction. Thus, the destruction of sacred sites is not only a theft of land, but of cultural memory itself. Livelihood for the Subanen has always been tied to the natural environment. For centuries, they practiced swidden farming, known as kaiingen, which involved carefully rotating crops to allow the land to rest. They cultivated corn, cassava, root crops, and rice, supplemented by fishing, hunting, and gathering forest products. This system was not only sustainable, but deeply respectful of ecological balance. However, the intrusion of mining drastically disrupted this cycle. The clearing of forests eliminated sources of wild food and medicinal plants. Rivers, once teeming with fish, became polluted with silt and chemicals. Agricultural yields fell as soil fertility declined, and swidden cycles were shortened or abandoned. Families who once lived in relative self-sufficiency now faced food insecurity, forcing them to buy rice and vegetables from markets at high costs. Promises of jobs from mining companies rarely compensated for these losses. Most positions were temporary, low-paying, and often given to outsiders. The result was economic displacement. A community that had lived off its ancestral land for generations suddenly found itself dependent on external systems for survival. This collapse of livelihood was more than material. It eroded dignity. To the Subanen, farming is not just work, but a way of life that ties them to their ancestors. When that system breaks down, it severs bonds of identity and continuity. The shift from independence to dependency deepens feelings of vulnerability, leaving the Subanen trapped in cycles of poverty created by forces beyond their control. The disruption of sacred sites and livelihoods has also produced a more subtle but equally destructive force: intergenerational trauma. Elders, who once took pride in passing down farming techniques, rituals, and oral histories, now struggle with grief as they watch their traditions crumble. Children grow up seeing bulldozers where rituals once took place, or drinking from rivers that elders remember as pure. This disconnect creates confusion, as the stories of the past no longer match the reality of the present. Many young Subanen are forced to leave their villages in search of work or education, leading to further alienation from ancestral practices. Over time, language weakens, rituals are forgotten, and cultural pride diminishes. The trauma of displacement and cultural erosion is carried silently in households, manifesting in loss of confidence, despair, or even shame in being indigenous. Scholars describe this as cultural genocide, the systematic erasure of traditions, not always through violence, but through economic and environmental forces that make survival impossible within ancestral frameworks. For the Subanen, the pain of cultural loss is compounded by the knowledge that it was preventable, that their sacred sites and livelihoods were sacrificed for profits that never flowed back to them. Yet, even amidst this trauma, resistance continues. Elders still tell stories, leaders still call for justice, and communities still gather for rituals, even if only in fragmented ways. These acts of resilience are crucial, for they show that while culture can be wounded, it cannot be fully destroyed. The Subanen continue to hold on to fragments of their identity, planting seeds of hope for future generations who may yet reclaim what has been lost. Throughout the struggles of the Subanen, violence has been repeatedly used not as random brutality, but as a calculated language of power. Mining corporations, local political elites, and even armed groups have recognized that fear can achieve what persuasion and legality cannot. Instead of convincing communities to surrender their ancestral lands, intimidation, harassment, and killings are used to silence resistance. The murder of tribal leaders, such as Barlai Balai's, is not an isolated crime, but part of a larger pattern. Remove the most outspoken voices, and the rest of the community will fall into line. In this way, violence becomes systemic. It does not target every individual, but strategically strikes those who symbolize collective will. By assassinating a leader, burning a house, or abducting a family member, outside forces create ripple effects of fear that reach every corner of a community. Families whisper at night about whether to continue resisting or to remain quiet for safety's sake. Meetings that once gathered dozens shrink as people avoid visibility. Even spiritual rituals are conducted in secrecy, lest they attract unwanted attention. For the Subanen, this weaponization of violence reveals a painful truth, that their struggle is not merely against bulldozers and corporate contracts, but against a machinery of terror designed to break their spirit. What outsiders see as isolated incidents are, in fact, deliberate strategies woven into the broader push to control land and silence indigenous dissent. Another dimension of targeted violence against the Subanen is what activists call criminalization of resistance. Leaders who stand firm against mining projects or corrupt officials often find themselves facing fabricated legal charges. They are accused of trespassing on land that is rightfully theirs, of inciting unrest, or even of supporting insurgent groups. This tactic weaponizes the law against the very people it is meant to protect. Court hearings drain resources, travel costs burden families, and leaders spend more time defending themselves in legal proceedings than organizing their communities. Meanwhile, the public narrative is manipulated to portray them as lawbreakers rather than defenders of ancestral rights. For instance, Indigenous peoples' mandatory representatives who question the legitimacy of mining permits are sometimes accused of abuse of authority. Others are painted as anti-development troublemakers. This strategy is particularly insidious because it cloaks violence in legality. Unlike outright killings, which attract international condemnation, the criminalization of leaders can be framed as due process. Yet the effect is the same. It weakens resistance, isolates leaders, and discourages others from stepping into leadership roles. For the Subanen, this dual assault, physical violence combined with legal persecution, creates a suffocating environment. Even when they invoke the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, IPRA, they find the law turned against them. Resistance, instead of being recognized as a constitutional right, is redefined as a crime. In this way, violence is not only physical, but institutional, embedded within the very structures that should have been their shield. For ordinary Subanen families, targeted violence has transformed daily life into an existence lived under the shadow of fear. Parents worry not only about feeding their children, but also about whether their sons will be recruited by armed groups or harassed by security forces. Women carry the double burden of holding households together while fearing that their husbands or brothers may not return from community meetings. Youths, instead of inheriting a sense of pride in their heritage, grow up in an atmosphere where speaking out is equated with danger. This climate of fear serves its purpose. It fragments communities, silences resistance, and forces individuals to retreat into private survival rather than collective struggle. Yet it also creates unintended consequences. For some young Subanen, the loss of leaders becomes a call to action, fueling a determination to continue the fight their elders began. Organizations, both local and international, step into document abuses, shining a light on violence that authorities try to conceal. In this way, even as fear hangs heavy, it does not entirely extinguish hope. Still, the psychological toll is profound. Villagers wake at night to the memory of gunshots, avoid public gatherings, and censor their own voices. The Subanen thus live not only in physical displacement, but in a condition of spiritual siege. Violence becomes an everyday horizon, shaping choices, dreams, and silences. For a people whose culture once flourished in open rituals and communal gatherings, this imposed silence is perhaps the deepest wound of all. It is the invisible scar carried by every Subanen child who grows up knowing that to speak truth is to invite danger. The Subanen live in a landscape not only shaped by mountains and rivers, but also by overlapping forces of conflict. On one side stand the New People's Army, NPA, claiming to fight for revolution, but often intruding into ancestral domains. On the other side are state-linked militias, paramilitary groups, and military units tasked with counterinsurgency operations. For the Subanen, this creates an impossible dilemma. If they refuse cooperation with the NPA, they risk violent reprisals. If they cooperate, they're branded as rebels by the state. Similarly, if they host soldiers or allow paramilitary camps in their villages, they become targets of NPA suspicion. This dual burden traps them in what many describe as a conflict sandwich, squeezed between competing powers that both claim legitimacy, but neither fully respects indigenous autonomy. Families recount stories of being forced to cook meals for one group one day and interrogated by another the next. The Subanen never asked to be part of this war, yet their lands, strategically valuable for their resources and location, have become contested terrain. What should be sanctuaries of culture and tradition are militarized zones where suspicion dictates daily life. In this environment, neutrality is almost impossible, and silence itself becomes dangerous. Paramilitary groups, sometimes euphemistically called civilian volunteer organizations or local defense forces, have been deployed in Subanen territories under the justification of securing mining projects and countering insurgents. Yet these groups often act with impunity, intimidating communities, threatening leaders, and even participating in forced evictions. Unlike formal military units, paramilitaries operate in a gray zone, linked to the state yet not held to the same standards of accountability. For the Subanen, their presence feels like living under occupation. Camps are built near villages, movements are monitored, and dissent is quickly suppressed. Community members who resist mining projects find themselves harassed not only by corporations, but also by armed men who claim to defend development. Reports from human rights monitors highlight how these paramilitary forces sometimes receive logistical support from mining companies, further blurring the line between corporate interest and state power. For Subanen elders, this represents a continuation of historical injustices, where external powers use local armed groups to enforce control while avoiding direct accountability. The use of militias fractures trust between communities and the government, making reconciliation and genuine dialogue increasingly difficult. Instead of protection, the Subanen experienced militarization as another layer of exploitation. The constant presence of armed groups has transformed Subanen villages in subtle but devastating ways. Fields once tilled freely are abandoned because families fear crossing paths with patrols or being accused of aiding rebels. Ritual gatherings are canceled because large assemblies attract suspicion from both sides. Even the laughter of children is muted, as parents warn them not to speak carelessly lest their words be overheard. This militarization erodes not just security, but the very rhythm of everyday life. Farming cycles are disrupted, marriages postponed, and festivals forgotten. The social fabric that once revolved around trust and ritual is replaced by an atmosphere of caution and silence. For youths, growing up under militarization means inheriting trauma rather than tradition. They learn not the songs of the ancestors, but the sound of gunfire echoing across valleys. Women, often at the forefront of keeping households together, bear the heaviest burden. They must navigate checkpoints, negotiate with soldiers, and shield their children from the realities of violence. Over time, this constant pressure normalizes fear, embedding it into the very structure of daily living. Yet beneath this atmosphere of control lies an unspoken resilience. Despite intimidation, families still plant, rituals still occur in secret, and stories of resistance are whispered from one generation to the next. Militarization may erode the visible aspects of Subanen life, but it cannot fully extinguish their determination to endure. This quiet persistence is itself a form of defiance, a reminder that even in the shadow of militias and insurgents, the Subanen spirit continues to resist erasure. The Subanen's struggle for recognition has often been met with silence from the very institutions mandated to protect them. Agencies such as the National Commission on Indigenous Peoples, NCP, exist to safeguard ancestral rights, yet their performance is frequently criticized as slow, inconsistent, or outright negligent. Petitions for certificates of ancestral domain title, CADT, which should provide legal recognition of indigenous lands, often take decades to process. While files sit in Manila or regional offices, corporations continue extracting minerals, cutting trees, and building infrastructure on Subanen soil. To community members, this bureaucratic limbo feels deliberate, a way to stall until resistance weakens and outside interests consolidate control. Elders who march for hours to reach government offices return with nothing more than promises of further review. This endless cycle of delay erodes trust in the state. Silence, in this context, becomes an active form of violence. It robs the Subanen not only of their lands, but of their faith that the law can serve as a shield. For families waiting for answers, government neglect is not abstract. It is felt in polluted rivers, barren fields, and children who ask why nothing changes despite their elders' constant appeals. The silence of state agencies thus deepens the wound of marginalization, showing that neglect can be as destructive as outright exploitation. Bureaucracy is often presented as a neutral system of governance, but for the Subanen, it has become a tool of disempowerment. Documents are lost or shuffled between offices. Requirements multiply, demanding costly surveys, legal fees, and consultations that poor communities cannot afford. Even when papers are completed, signatures are delayed or withheld. This creates a cycle of dependency where indigenous peoples must continually beg the state for recognition. Worse still, bureaucratic processes are sometimes weaponized. Mining companies exploit delays to argue that since ancestral domain claims are unresolved, projects can proceed. Local officials, aligned with corporate interests, present themselves as more efficient alternatives, further undermining Indigenous authority. In this way, bureaucracy does not merely fail, it actively reinforces inequality. Instead of empowering communities, it traps them in endless paperwork while their lands are consumed. For Subanen leaders, navigating this system is exhausting. They must spend scarce resources on travel, legal assistance, and documentation, all while trying to maintain their farms and cultural practices. Bureaucracy, then, becomes more than inefficiency. It is a deliberate barrier that favors the powerful and drains the marginalized. The Subanen are left with the painful realization that the system meant to recognize their rights is the very system that ensures those rights remain out of reach. Behind every delayed petition, every ignored complaint, lies a human cost. For the Subanen, institutional neglect translates into hunger, displacement, and despair. Families displaced by mining operations wait years for relocation assistance that never comes. Communities seeking clean water after rivers are poisoned by silt and chemicals are told to wait for government programs that remain unfunded. Health clinics, if they exist, lack doctors or medicine. Schools in remote villages receive little support, leaving children to study without books or trained teachers. This neglect sends a painful message that Subanen lives are valued less than the profits extracted from their land. The emotional toll is immense. Elders lament that their efforts to secure recognition during their lifetime may come too late, leaving the next generation without the legal protection they fought for. Young people, seeing the state's indifference, often migrate to cities in search of work, further weakening community cohesion. Institutional neglect thus perpetuates a cycle of vulnerability. Marginalized communities remain marginalized precisely because the state refuses to act with urgency. For the Subanen, this is the sharpest betrayal of all, that the very government sworn to protect them turns its back when protection is most needed. Yet amidst this neglect, their determination persists. Each protest, each petition, each ritual performed in defiance of abandonment is a testament to their refusal to vanish quietly. In this endurance lies both tragedy and hope. Tragedy, because neglect should never be the price of survival. Hope, because despite it, the Subanen continue to fight for recognition and dignity. For generations, the Subanen thrived in harmony with the forests of the Zamboanga Peninsula. These forests were more than a source of timber or farmland. They were living sanctuaries providing food, medicinal plants, and clean water. Yet with the arrival of large-scale mining and logging, these ecosystems began to collapse. Hillsides that once stood thick with trees were stripped bare to make way for roads, heavy machinery, and extraction sites. Watersheds that supplied villages with fresh water shrank as forests could no longer hold rainfall, leading to erosion and flooding. The streams, once clean and abundant with fish, turned brown and lifeless, carrying the silt and chemical runoff from mining operations. Families that once relied on bamboo shoots, wild fruits, and medicinal herbs from the forest found these resources disappearing. Elders recall with sorrow the days when a walk into the forest meant gathering food for the family and herbs for healing. Today, such walks often end with the sight of barren land and polluted rivers. The disappearance of forests is not just an ecological crisis, but a cultural one, severing the Subanen's intimate relationship with nature. Each tree cut, each river poisoned, erodes a piece of their identity. The destruction of watersheds also has cascading effects far beyond indigenous lands. Lowland communities, dependent on these rivers for irrigation and drinking water, also suffer. Thus, the ecological devastation in Subanen territory is not an isolated tragedy, but part of a wider environmental collapse that threatens the entire region. The Subanen lands are part of one of the most biodiverse regions in the Philippines, home to countless species of plants and animals. In traditional belief, each of these creatures is part of a spiritual web of life, deserving respect and care. But with mining and deforestation, this delicate balance is unraveling. Birds that once filled the skies are disappearing as their habitats vanish. Animals that sustained Subanen hunting practices, wild boars, deer, and smaller mammals, have retreated deeper into the forest or disappeared altogether. Medicinal plants, vital not only to health but to ritual healing practices, have become rare. This biodiversity loss has material consequences. Without wild game, families rely more heavily on store-bought food, which is costly and less nutritious. Without medicinal plants, communities must depend on distant clinics, which are often underfunded or unavailable. The ecological disruption also increases vulnerability to natural disasters. With fewer trees to stabilize the soil, landslides become more frequent. Without forest cover, droughts last longer and floods hit harder. For the Subanen, these are not abstract environmental issues. They are lived realities that shape survival. Elders warn that the spirits who guard the forests are angered by this imbalance, and many interpret the increase in natural disasters as a sign of cosmic disapproval. Science and spirituality converge in this interpretation. The loss of biodiversity destabilizes both ecosystems and cultural systems, leaving the Subanen exposed to crises from every direction. The environmental devastation faced by the Subanen does not exist in isolation. It is magnified by global climate change. As temperatures rise and weather patterns become unpredictable, indigenous communities who depend directly on the land are among the most vulnerable. Deforestation and mining exacerbate this vulnerability by stripping away the natural defenses that forests once provided. Floods, droughts, and storms strike harder in degraded landscapes. Crops fail more frequently, and water sources dry up more quickly. For the Subanen, this means a daily struggle for food and water security. Climate change also intensifies displacement. When floods wash away homes or landslides bury fields, families are forced to migrate, leaving behind ancestral lands. This deepens the cultural wound, as rituals tied to specific landscapes can no longer be performed. Moreover, the global discourse on climate change often ignores indigenous voices, even though they are among the most affected. International funds and programs flow into national agencies, but rarely reach communities like the Subanen. This exclusion reinforces their marginalization, leaving them to face global crises with local resources alone. Yet within this vulnerability lies a profound irony. The Subanen, whose traditional ways of life were inherently sustainable, now pay the heaviest price for environmental destruction largely caused by outsiders. Their story is a stark reminder that the ecological crisis is not only about carbon emissions or rising temperatures. It is about justice, equity, and whose lives are most expendable in the pursuit of profit. For the Subanen, the convergence of local exploitation and global climate change has created a perfect storm that threatens their survival as a people. For centuries, Subanen society was guided by traditional governance rooted in the authority of the Timue, tribal leader, and the Gukum, council of elders or tribunal. These institutions were not just political structures. They were deeply spiritual, embodying the wisdom of the ancestors and the will of the spirits. The Timue served as both leader and mediator, ensuring harmony within the community and between humans and the natural world. The Gukum, meanwhile, functioned as the custodian of justice, settling disputes through dialogue consensus, and ritual. Unlike state courts, which rely on adversarial processes, the Gukum emphasized restoration and balance. Decisions were made not only with logic, but with respect for cultural traditions, often sealed with rituals to affirm community solidarity. This system ensured cohesion, fairness, and respect for indigenous laws long before colonial governments imposed their own structures. However, with the intrusion of mining companies, armed groups, and government interference, these traditional systems have been systematically undermined. The Timue's authority has been bypassed by officials who prefer to negotiate with individuals willing to sign consent agreements. The Gukum's rulings, though respected within the community, are dismissed by state courts. This erosion of authority leaves the Subanen vulnerable, for without strong governance, they struggle to present a unified front against external pressures. What was once a proud and respected institution is now constantly tested, forced to operate in the shadows of state bureaucracy and corporate power. One of the most insidious strategies employed by mining companies and politicians is the co-optation of Subanen leadership. By offering bribes, employment, or promises of development, external actors target certain individuals within the community, weakening collective decision-making. Traditional leaders who resist exploitation are sidelined, while those willing to compromise are elevated as representatives in official processes. This creates confusion over legitimacy. Who truly speaks for the Subanen? In some cases, corporations claim to have secured the community's consent through agreements signed by only a handful of leaders, while the majority remains opposed. The result is fragmentation. Elders accuse one another of betrayal. Families argue over who is right, and the once unified authority of the Timue is diluted. The Subanen concept of leadership, which once relied on trust, integrity, and service to the community, is now tainted by suspicion. This manipulation is not accidental. It is a deliberate strategy to weaken indigenous resistance by turning leaders into instruments of division. For younger Subanen, witnessing these divisions erodes faith in their own institutions. They see the Timue's voice ignored in official channels and question the effectiveness of their cultural systems. Over time, this weakens intergenerational respect for traditional governance, leaving the community more vulnerable to outside exploitation. The co-optation of leadership, therefore, is not just political interference. It is cultural sabotage, striking at the very heart of Subanen cohesion. Despite these challenges, the Subanen continue to fight for the survival of their governance systems. Elders still convene the Gukum to resolve disputes, invoking ancestral wisdom even when their decisions hold no weight in state law. Timue leaders still perform rituals, reminding their people that authority comes not only from external recognition, but from spiritual responsibility. Yet the struggle to preserve these systems grows harder with each passing generation. Younger Subanen, educated in state schools and exposed to modern political systems, often straddle two worlds. Some see traditional governance as outdated, while others recognize it as a vital anchor of identity. The challenge, then, is to adapt traditional governance to the realities of the present without losing its essence. In some communities, Timue leaders have begun collaborating with NGOs and human rights groups, using modern advocacy tools to amplify the authority of their traditions. Others have sought legal recognition for their councils, pushing for hybrid models that respect both indigenous and state laws. These efforts represent resilience in the face of erosion. Yet the battle is uphill. As long as state institutions and corporations dismiss or manipulate indigenous authority, the Subanen's governance remains precarious. Still, the very survival of the Timue and Gukum despite centuries of colonization and decades of modern exploitation, is itself a form of defiance. It shows that even under immense pressure, Subanen governance refuses to vanish. Instead, it adapts, resists, and continues to remind the world that justice is not only written in laws, but lived in the traditions of a people who will not surrender their dignity. For generations, Subanen knowledge was passed orally, through stories, rituals, farming practices, and the wisdom of elders. Education was experiential, rooted in the land and infused with spirituality. But with the introduction of formal schooling by missionaries, colonizers, and later the Philippine state, a new system emerged that often clashed with Subanen traditions. On one hand, education opened doors, literacy, access to information, and opportunities to engage with wider society. On the other hand, it often came with a hidden cost, the erosion of cultural pride. Classrooms, especially in earlier decades, taught history from a lowland perspective, framing indigenous peoples as backward or primitive. Subanen children sometimes endured ridicule, being told that their traditions were uncivilized. For parents, this created a painful dilemma. They wanted their children to succeed in modern society, but feared that education would alienate them from their heritage. Stories abound of children returning from school embarrassed to speak their language or reluctant to join rituals. The promise of education as empowerment was thus entangled with the peril of cultural assimilation. This tension remains today as the Subanen navigate how to balance the need for formal education with the preservation of ancestral knowledge. The challenge is not simply to send children to school, but to ensure that schooling strengthens rather than weakens their identity. One of the clearest signs of cultural disruption is the weakening of the Subanen language among the youth. In many villages, children grow up speaking Cebuano or Tagalog, the dominant regional and national languages, while only partially understanding Subanen. This shift is not accidental. It is reinforced by the school system, mass media, and migration. Elders lament that their grandchildren can no longer follow traditional chants or fully comprehend oral histories. Language, after all, is more than communication. It carries worldviews, spiritual concepts, and cultural nuance that cannot be easily translated. Without it, rituals lose meaning, stories lose depth, and intergenerational bonds weaken. The erosion of language creates a painful disconnect. Elders struggle to pass on wisdom, while youth find it difficult to anchor themselves in traditions. This disconnection also heightens vulnerability to external manipulation. When young Subanen are less grounded in their identity, they're more likely to be swayed by promises of jobs from mining firms or pressured by armed groups. The weakening of language is thus both a cultural and political loss. Yet resistance persists. Some communities are reviving language instruction through informal classes, church initiatives, or cultural camps. These efforts, though small, represent sparks of renewal, attempts to bridge the gap between generations before the chain of transmission is broken forever. Despite the challenges, many young Subanen are emerging as powerful voices of resistance. They recognize the injustices faced by their elders and are determined not to inherit a broken future. Some join NGOs, human rights groups, or student organizations, using modern tools like social media to amplify their struggles. Others return to their villages after studying in cities, bringing new skills while seeking to reconnect with their roots. This youth activism is not without struggle. They often face suspicion from elders who worry that modernization dilutes tradition, while also encountering hostility from authorities who see activism as subversion. Yet their role is crucial in bridging tradition and modernity. By blending ancestral pride with contemporary advocacy, young Subanen are crafting a new form of identity, one that resists erasure while engaging with the modern world. They organize cultural festivals, document oral histories, and campaign for Indigenous rights in courts and international forums. In doing so, they challenge the narrative that being Indigenous is a disadvantage. Instead, they assert it as a source of strength. This reclamation of identity by the youth signals hope. Even if sacred sites are desecrated and livelihoods disrupted, the Subanen spirit lives on in a new generation that refuses silence. The battle for identity, therefore, is not only about preservation, but about transformation, ensuring that the Subanen remain rooted in their heritage while adapting to the challenges of the 21st century. Long before missionaries set foot on the Zamboanga Peninsula, the Subanen had a rich spiritual worldview deeply rooted in their environment. They believed that spirits inhabited mountains, rivers, forests, and even the winds. Ancestors were venerated through rituals, offerings, and chants, ensuring harmony between the living and the unseen world. This belief system was not abstract theology, but a lived practice interwoven with daily life. Farming was accompanied by rituals seeking permission from the spirits of the land. Healing ceremonies invoked ancestral guardians for guidance. Festivals celebrated both the cycles of agriculture and the continuity of kinship. At the center of this spiritual life stood the Balian or ritual specialist, who mediated between humans and the spirit world. This ancestral faith gave the Subanen a strong sense of belonging and moral order, reminding them that the land was not property, but a sacred trust. Yet the arrival of missionaries, first Catholic, later Protestant, challenged this foundation. Churches were built in villages, introducing new rituals and cosmologies. Conversion was sometimes voluntary, sometimes pressured, and always disruptive. Over time, ancestral rituals were branded as pagan, even demonic, by outsiders who failed to grasp their cultural depth. This religious disruption left the Subanen with a spiritual dilemma: how to honor their ancestral ways while navigating the powerful influence of Christianity. Instead of simply abandoning their traditions, many Subanen communities developed a form of syncretism, blending elements of ancestral spirituality with Christian teachings. A festival might begin with a Catholic Mass, but continue with Subanen dances and rituals. Families might attend church on Sundays, but still offer food and prayers at sacred sites. This blending was not merely compromise, it was a strategy of survival. By integrating Christian practices, the Subanen avoided outright persecution, while quietly maintaining their identity. Yet this syncretism also produced tension. Elders struggled to preserve rituals that younger generations, raised in Christian schools, sometimes saw as outdated or sinful. Priests and pastors often condemned indigenous practices, urging full conversion. At the same time, some church groups became allies, defending indigenous rights and even incorporating local culture into liturgy. The result is a patchwork of spiritual practices across Subanen communities, some leaning heavily toward Christianity, others clinging strongly to ancestral rituals, and many existing in the middle, where boundaries blur. This syncretism reflects both resilience and vulnerability. It shows the Subanen's ability to adapt, but also highlights how external religions have reshaped their worldview, often in ways that weaken traditional authority. The tension between continuity and change remains unresolved, playing out in every ritual, every prayer, and every intergenerational conversation about what it means to be truly Subanen. In the modern era, the Subanen's spiritual struggle has intensified under new pressures. Globalization brings television, social media, and outside values that further erode ancestral practices. Evangelical groups expand aggressively in remote areas, sometimes condemning rituals as obstacles to progress. Meanwhile, mining and deforestation destroy sacred sites, making it physically impossible to perform certain ceremonies. Youth growing up in this context often face conflicting identities, one shaped by Christian teachings, another whispered through ancestral stories. Some choose to abandon rituals altogether, while others rediscover them as symbols of resistance. For example, rituals once performed quietly have reemerged during protests against mining, where elders invoke ancestral spirits to defend the land. In these moments, spirituality becomes a political act, affirming that the Subanen struggle is not only legal or environmental, but profoundly sacred. Yet the cost of sustaining this spiritual identity is high. Communities risk ridicule, alienation, and even violence for defending practices misunderstood by outsiders. Still, the persistence of rituals, prayers, and spiritual narratives reveals the Subanen's determination not to let their ancestral faith vanish. Their religious journey is not one of simple replacement, but of constant negotiation, balancing external pressures with internal resilience. In this struggle lies both fragility and strength. Fragility, because external forces continue to erode spiritual practices. Strength, because despite centuries of missionary influence and modern challenges, the Subanen continue to find ways to honor their ancestors and the spirits of their land. Within the Subanen community, gender roles have historically been complementary rather than strictly hierarchical. Men and women both carried vital responsibilities that ensured the survival and cohesion of the group. Men often took on tasks such as hunting, clearing land for swidden farming, or negotiating with outsiders, while women were the backbone of agricultural work, household management, and cultural continuity. Women were not only farmers and mothers, they were also keepers of ritual knowledge. Many acted as Balian, ritual specialists who mediated between humans and the spirit world, invoking ancestral guidance during planting seasons, healing ceremonies, or crises. The position of Bay, female leader or respected elder, held cultural significance, with women recognized for their wisdom in resolving disputes or guiding families. These roles show that Subanen society valued balance rather than dominance, seeing both genders as crucial to communal harmony. Yet colonial influences and missionary teachings began to reshape this equilibrium. Women were gradually pushed into more domestic roles, their ritual authority dismissed as superstition by outsiders. Still, in daily life, Subanen women continued to embody resilience, sustaining not just families, but the cultural fabric of their people. Their voices carried weight in family councils, and their labor sustained both fields and homes. This traditional recognition of women's importance would later become a source of strength when external forces disrupted the community, placing new burdens on their shoulders. With the intrusion of mining companies, armed groups, and government neglect, Subanen women found themselves bearing a double burden. As families were displaced from their ancestral lands, it was women who often shouldered the responsibility of keeping households together in evacuation centers or resettlement areas. They cooked meals with scarce resources, cared for children under stressful conditions, and tried to preserve a sense of normalcy amidst chaos. At the same time, they endured unique forms of vulnerability. Reports from human rights monitors note that women in indigenous communities sometimes face harassment at checkpoints, intimidation from soldiers, or coercion from armed groups. The destruction of farms and rivers also struck women particularly hard, as they were traditionally responsible for food security. When cornfields failed and rivers were poisoned, It was mothers who confronted the daily question of how to feed their children. Beyond material burdens, displacement disrupted cultural roles. Rituals led by women, once tied to sacred sites, became difficult to perform in unfamiliar or degraded landscapes. Young girls, instead of learning these practices, grew up in environments shaped by poverty, fear, and alienation. Yet despite these hardships, Subanen women emerged as powerful pillars of resilience. Many became vocal in community protests, leading marches, confronting company officials, or testifying before courts and advocacy groups. Their courage underscored the reality that Indigenous resistance is not only fought by men with loud voices, but also by women who sustain life, culture, and defiance in the face of systemic exploitation. In recent years, Subanen women have increasingly stepped into formal leadership roles, challenging stereotypes and reclaiming authority. Figures such as Indigenous women leaders and IPMR representatives embody this transformation, showing that resistance is not limited by gender. Women often articulate the struggle in ways that resonate deeply, grounding political resistance in the language of survival and motherhood. They speak not only of land and rights, but of the future of their children, framing environmental destruction as a violation of both culture and kinship. This moral force has made women's voices particularly powerful in advocacy, both within their communities and in wider forums. Some Subanen women have joined regional and national Indigenous networks, amplifying their cause at international levels. Others focus on grassroots initiatives, reviving traditional crafts, teaching young people the Subanen language, or preserving ritual practices. These acts of cultural renewal are as vital as political protests, ensuring that identity is not only defended, but actively rebuilt. At the same time, challenges remain. Patriarchal norms from both mainstream society and colonial legacies still shape perceptions of leadership, forcing women to constantly prove their legitimacy. But the persistence of women in the front line of struggle highlights a broader truth, that the survival of the Subanen is inseparable from the resilience of its women. In their roles as nurturers, leaders, and custodians of tradition, Subanen women embody both continuity and change. Their presence ensures that resistance is not just about defending land, but about reweaving the social and cultural fabric torn apart by centuries of exploitation. The Subanen have always defined themselves through the land. Mountains, rivers, and forests were not simply places to live, but living relatives woven into their culture and spirituality. In the last decades, many Subanen families have been forced to leave these ancestral domains, driven by a combination of displacement, poverty, and conflict. Mining projects stripped the soil, leaving farms unproductive. Armed clashes between state forces and insurgents turned villages into battlegrounds. Government neglect leaves schools underfunded and health services absent. Faced with these pressures, families often make the difficult choice to migrate to towns or cities in search of survival. Leaving ancestral land is not just a geographical shift. It is a rupture in cultural continuity. Rituals tied to sacred spaces cannot be easily performed in concrete neighborhoods. Agricultural knowledge passed down through generations loses relevance when families move into wage labor economies. Children who once grew up hearing stories under starlit skies now spend evenings in crowded boarding houses, disconnected from their heritage. Migration fractures the social fabric, scattering families and weakening communal solidarity. For elders, this exodus is heartbreaking, for every departure feels like another step away from the identity that has sustained the Subanen for centuries. Yet for many families, Migration becomes the only option left in a world where ancestral land can no longer provide a secure life. In towns and cities, Subanen migrants often find themselves at the bottom of the labor hierarchy. Without the educational and financial advantages of lowland Filipinos, they take on the hardest and lowest paying jobs: construction work, domestic labor, street vending, or factory shifts. For young Subanen women, many end up as housemaids in urban households, where they face exploitation, long hours, and sometimes abuse. Men often work in construction or as drivers, laboring under unsafe conditions for meager wages. These jobs provide some cash income, but rarely enough to lift families out of poverty. Worse, they come at the cost of dignity. In rural life, farming and foraging tied people to the land and gave them autonomy. In urban labor, Subanen workers must submit to employers who often treat them as disposable. This economic exploitation is compounded by cultural discrimination. Migrant Subanen are sometimes ridiculed for their accents, clothing, or customs, reinforcing feelings of alienation. Children in urban schools often hide their indigenous identity to avoid bullying. This erasure of cultural pride can be more painful than economic hardship. It transforms migration from a temporary survival strategy into a permanent wound that reshapes identity. Instead of being proud custodians of ancestral land, many Subanen migrants are reduced to anonymous laborers in crowded urban centers, struggling to hold on to fragments of who they are. Despite these challenges, migration has not fully erased Subanen identity. In diaspora, communities have begun to form new strategies of resilience. Migrant groups gather during weekends or holidays to celebrate rituals, festivals, or simply to reconnect with others who share their heritage. Elders teach songs and dances in cramped city apartments, ensuring that younger generations retain some link to their culture. NGOs and advocacy groups also play a role, providing spaces for Subanen migrants to assert their rights and tell their stories. Yet the challenges remain immense. Distance from ancestral land means rituals tied to sacred mountains cannot be properly performed. Economic pressures leave little time for cultural renewal. Intermarriage with other groups sometimes accelerates assimilation, leading to further erosion of language and tradition. Still, within this fragile diaspora lies a spark of defiance. For many young Subanen growing up in urban areas, discovering their roots becomes an act of pride and rebellion against a society that tries to erase them. Social media has also become a tool of connection, allowing scattered Subanen communities to share stories, organize campaigns, and keep cultural memory alive. Migration may have scattered the people, but it has not silenced their spirit. The Subanen's fight to reclaim identity in the face of displacement is a reminder that culture is not bound only by geography. It lives wherever people carry it. Yet, as elders warn, unless the ties to ancestral land are reestablished, future generations risk becoming Subanen in name only. The struggle of the diaspora is thus not only economic but existential, to survive the city without losing the mountain. When the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, IPRA, was passed in 1997, one of its most celebrated features was the creation of the Indigenous Peoples Mandatory Representative, IPMR system. This provision guaranteed that indigenous groups like the Subanen would have a voice in local legislative councils, from the barangay level all the way to provincial boards. On paper, this was revolutionary. For the first time, communities long silenced by colonial and post-colonial systems were assured of political representation within mainstream governance. For the Subanen, who had long been excluded from decision-making that directly affected their lands, the promise of a seat at the table was profoundly symbolic. Elders hoped that IPMRs would serve as guardians of ancestral rights, ensuring that local governments could no longer ignore Indigenous voices when drafting policies or granting permits. Yet in practice, this promise has proven fragile. The process of selecting IPMRs is often fraught with manipulation. Some leaders are chosen through genuine community consultation, but others are handpicked by local officials or influenced by corporate interests. Instead of amplifying the Subanen's voice, the system sometimes silences it by installing compliant representatives who rubber stamp exploitative projects. Thus, what began as a mechanism of empowerment has too often been twisted into another tool of control, revealing the gap between legal guarantees and lived realities. Even when IPMRs are genuinely chosen by their communities, they face immense challenges in asserting their authority within political structures dominated by lowland elites. In municipal councils or provincial boards, the lone Indigenous representative is often outnumbered and sidelined. Their motions are ignored, their votes overwhelmed by majority blocs aligned with business or political patrons. Some IPMRs report being mocked for their accents or dismissed as anti-development whenever they oppose mining or logging projects. The lack of resources further compounds their marginalization. While other counselors have staff, budgets, and access to networks, IPMRs are often left with little institutional support. Worse, their tenure is insecure. Political pressures can lead to challenges against their legitimacy, forcing them to constantly defend their right to hold office. For Subanen IPMRs, the experience is often bittersweet. They enter politics with the hope of defending their people, but find themselves isolated, harassed, or even threatened. Some have been slapped with fabricated charges, accused of corruption, or targeted by violence simply for opposing powerful interests. This constant hostility reflects the broader reality that Indigenous representation in the Philippines, while legally mandated, remains precarious. The Subanen struggle to be heard in governance is not only about occupying seats, but about dismantling the structures that reduce those seats to symbolic gestures. Despite these challenges, the Subanen continue to fight for meaningful political representation. Communities have become more vigilant in monitoring the selection of IPMRs, resisting attempts by local officials to manipulate the process. NGOs and church groups provide training and support, equipping Indigenous leaders with knowledge of laws and advocacy strategies. Younger Subanen, educated in both traditional and formal systems, are beginning to step into political roles with renewed determination. They recognize that representation must go beyond occupying seats. It requires transforming governance itself. In some municipalities, Subanen IPMRs have successfully blocked harmful projects or pushed for ancestral domain recognition, proving that representation can matter when backed by strong community support. Social media and grassroots organizing also amplify their voices, allowing them to reach national and even international audiences. The challenge moving forward is to ensure that these efforts are not isolated victories, but part of a broader movement toward genuine empowerment. For the Subanen, political representation is not a luxury, it is a lifeline. Without it, decisions about their lands and lives will continue to be made without them. With it, however fragile, lies the hope of reclaiming dignity and control over their future. The struggle for political voice is thus inseparable from the struggle for survival. Each seat won, each motion raised, each protest echoed in council chambers is part of a larger narrative. The refusal of the Subanen to remain silent in a system designed to marginalize them. Throughout the Subanen struggle, one of the most consistent allies has been the network of churches and faith-based organizations. Catholic missionaries, Protestant pastors, and ecumenical groups have often stood side by side with indigenous leaders in resisting mining projects and human rights violations. For many Subanen, this solidarity has been both spiritual and political. Church groups not only provide moral support, but also document abuses, issue public statements, and mobilize wider networks of advocacy. For example, the Columban missionaries have consistently spoken out against the desecration of Mount Canatuan and the violence inflicted on Subanen leaders. These faith-based alliances frame the struggle not only as a political issue, but as a moral one, appealing to the conscience of society. Rituals, prayers, and masses have been held at protest sites, blending Subanen spirituality with Christian traditions in acts of defiance. This partnership has not been without tension, especially since Christian missionaries were historically part of cultural disruption. Yet over time, many Subanen communities have embraced church allies who respect indigenous traditions and stand firmly against exploitation. These alliances provide the Subanen with visibility and protection, as churches carry moral authority that corporations and government officials cannot easily dismiss. The role of faith-based solidarity thus illustrates how old wounds of colonialism can be reworked into new forms of partnership for justice. Non-governmental organizations, NGOs, and human rights groups have also been vital in amplifying the Subanen struggle. Organizations such as Mining Watch Canada, Amnesty International, and local Philippine groups like IPON have documented violations, filed reports with international bodies, and pressured governments to act. These groups provide technical expertise that the Subanen alone could not easily access. Lawyers to challenge permits, researchers to measure environmental damage, and advocates to bring cases before the United Nations or other international institutions. Legal advocacy has highlighted the violations of free, prior, and informed consent, FPIC, exposing how corporations manipulated or bypassed indigenous communities. Reports submitted to the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, CRD, helped draw global attention to the Canatuan mine conflict. This global visibility has sometimes restrained corporations and pressured governments, though not always with immediate results. For the Subanen, NGOs represent an extension of their voice beyond the mountains of Zamboanga, carrying their stories to Manila, Geneva, and beyond. At the same time, reliance on external groups can be double-edged. Some NGOs come with their own agendas, while others struggle to sustain long-term commitments. Still, the presence of these allies strengthens the Subanen's resilience, reminding them that their struggle is not isolated, but part of a global fight for indigenous rights and environmental justice. In recent years, the Subanen struggle has increasingly connected with global movements for indigenous rights and environmental protection. Across continents, indigenous peoples face similar patterns of exploitation. Land seized for mining, forests cleared for profit, leaders silenced through intimidation or violence. By linking with these movements, the Subanen finds strength in solidarity. International conferences, solidarity visits, and social media campaigns have allowed their voices to resonate globally. Their plight is discussed alongside the struggles of Amazonian tribes, Canadian First Nations, and African pastoralist groups, highlighting the universal nature of indigenous resistance. This global solidarity reframes the Subanen's fight not as a local issue, but as part of a worldwide struggle against exploitation and ecological destruction. It also provides moral encouragement, knowing that others across the world recognize and support their struggle sustains hope in times of despair. At the same time, global solidarity brings strategic benefits. Transnational campaigns can target corporations in their home countries, pressure investors, and demand accountability beyond Philippine borders. The challenge, however, is to ensure that this solidarity remains grounded in the Subanen's own voice and leadership, rather than being overshadowed by external narratives. For the Subanen, building alliances is not about surrendering their struggle to outsiders, but about weaving a network of resistance that spans borders. In doing so, they transform their marginalization into a platform of visibility, reminding the world that the fight for indigenous survival is also a fight for the survival of the planet itself. The story of the Subanen is one of survival against overwhelming odds. For centuries, they have endured colonization, displacement, exploitation, and neglect. Spanish colonizers pushed them into the uplands. American authorities opened their territories to resource extraction, and the Philippine Republic allowed corporations and political elites to strip away their lands. Yet despite these waves of adversity, the Subanen have endured. Their resilience is visible not only in their survival, but in the persistence of their culture, rituals, and governance systems. Even when sacred sites were desecrated, elders continued to chant prayers to the spirits. Even when rivers were poisoned, families planted crops in degraded soils. Even when leaders were harassed, imprisoned, or killed, others stepped forward to carry the mantle of resistance. This resilience is not passive endurance. It is active defiance. By refusing to vanish, the Subanen remind the world that indigenous peoples are not relics of the past, but living communities shaping their futures. Their survival itself is a political statement, a rejection of the forces that sought to erase them. The lesson is profound. Resilience is not just about weathering storms, but about transforming pain into strength, memory into resistance, and identity into a weapon of survival. The Subanen struggle holds lessons that extend far beyond their ancestral domains. First, it exposes the fragility of legal protections when confronted with corruption and greed. The Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act promised security, yet without enforcement, it became vulnerable to manipulation. This teaches us that laws are only as strong as the political will to uphold them. Second, it highlights the destructive consequences of prioritizing profit over people. The Canatuan mine may have generated wealth for corporations and officials, but it left behind poisoned rivers, displaced communities, and desecrated culture. This is a cautionary tale for the Philippines and the global community. Development without justice is destruction disguised as progress. Third, the Subanen experience demonstrates the importance of indigenous knowledge. For centuries, their sustainable practices preserved biodiversity, safeguarded watersheds, and maintained balance with the environment. Ignoring such wisdom not only harms indigenous peoples, but also undermines humanity's fight against ecological collapse. Finally, their struggle reveals the power of solidarity. Alliances with churches, NGOs, and global networks have amplified their voices, showing that resistance grows stronger when shared. These lessons are urgent in an era of climate change, ecological crisis, and global inequality. The Subanen remind us that indigenous rights are not a side issue. They're central to building a just and sustainable future for all. As the Subanen look to the future, challenges remain immense. Mining companies still own their lands, government inertia persists, and armed groups continue to destabilize their communities. Yet there are also sparks of hope. Young Subanen are reclaiming their identity, blending ancestral traditions with modern advocacy tools. Elders continue to teach rituals, ensuring that spiritual continuity is not broken. Communities strengthen their governance systems, resisting manipulation and division. Globally, awareness of indigenous struggles is growing, giving the Subanen new platforms to demand justice. The future of the Subanen will depend on whether these sparks can be nurtured into lasting change, whether legal protections will finally be enforced, whether political systems will genuinely respect Indigenous voices, and whether the world will recognize that the survival of peoples like the Subanen is tied to the survival of the planet. For the Subanen themselves, the future is a matter of endurance and vision. They must continue to plant crops, tell stories, perform rituals, and raise children who know both the pain of their history and the pride of their heritage. Their story is not only one of loss, but of defiance, creativity, and hope. The Subanen remind us that even in the face of overwhelming forces, a people anchored in identity and solidarity cannot be erased. Their struggle is not finished, but neither is their spirit broken. The future remains unwritten, and in that uncertainty lies the possibility of justice. We have now walked together through 20 chapters of the Subanen story, each one unveiling layers of history, resilience, and struggle. From the desecration of Mount Canatuan to the failures of government bureaucracy, from the silencing of tribal leaders to the persistence of ancestral rituals, we have witnessed how a people rooted in the land fight to hold on to their dignity. What emerges is not only a narrative of suffering, but also one of extraordinary survival. The Subanen have endured centuries of marginalization, yet they remain standing. They have lost sacred sites, but they continue to pray. They have been displaced, but they continue to return. They have been silenced, but they continue to speak louder each generation. Their journey is not only about their own community, it is about what it means for any people to defend identity against the tide of exploitation. The Subanen remind us that survival is not passive. It is an act of defiance, a refusal to disappear. And as we conclude this series, we must carry with us the recognition that the Subanen's fight is part of a much larger human story. The struggle of Indigenous peoples everywhere to be respected, heard, and recognized as the original guardians of the earth. What lessons can we, as listeners and learners, take from the Subanen experience? First, that legal protections mean little without justice. The Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act looked powerful on paper, but without honest enforcement, it was easily bent by greed. Second, that development built on exploitation is not progress, it is destruction. The mining pits of Canatuan may have enriched corporations, but they left behind poisoned rivers, broken communities, and desecrated traditions. Third, the resilience is both cultural and spiritual. The Subanen have shown us that identity is not destroyed by displacement or violence. It adapts, resists, and survives. And finally, that solidarity is essential. The Subanen could not have amplified their voices without the support of churches, NGOs, and global advocacy networks. In turn, we too have a responsibility to stand with Indigenous peoples wherever they are, because their fight is also ours. They defend not only their ancestral domains, but the ecological balance of the earth that sustains us all. The moral is clear. A people may be marginalized, but if they remain rooted in identity, justice, and community, they cannot be erased. The Subanen are living proof of that truth. As we close this 2-hour history, I invite you not to see this as an ending, but as a beginning. The story of the Subanen continues, unfolding every day in the mountains of Mindanao, in the halls of government, in the protests against mining, and in the whispered songs of elders teaching children under starlit skies. Their resilience calls on us to listen more deeply, to learn more earnestly, and to act more courageously. On this channel, History Teller YT, we will continue to uncover untold histories, stories of peoples whose voices have been silenced but never extinguished. Today we learned about the Subanen, but tomorrow we may explore other indigenous struggles, forgotten empires, or hidden revolutions. If this story has moved you, let not stop here. Carry its lessons into your conversations, your classrooms, your activism, and your prayers. Share it so that others may understand that history is not just about kings and conquests, but about communities fighting for survival and dignity. And return here to this channel, where together we will continue to illuminate the past, not as a closed book, but as a living guide for the future. Because history is not only what has happened, it is also what we choose to remember. And in remembering the Subanen, we honor not only their struggle, but the enduring human spirit that binds us all.